Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sonia Berthasell, and I'm one of the coordinators for the USDA Northeast Climate Hub's GradCAP program. GradCAP is a virtual consortium of master's and doctoral students working on climate adaptation in agriculture, aquaculture, and forestry. Today's webinar on stakeholder beliefs and actions will run about 40 minutes and will highlight the work of two GradCAP scholars. We're glad you've tuned in. Please note that this webinar is being recorded for subsequent viewing. If you are just listening in today and have called in, please remember to put yourself on mute so you can hear the presenters, but they can't hear you over your phone lines. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speakers. Ruth Sexton is a master's student in ecology and environmental science at University of Maine and will present on climate change perceptions of small, medium, and beginning farmers and incorporating mental models into climate resilience outreach. And Alyssa Soucy is a master's student in the School of Forest Resources at University of Maine and will present her work on fostering climate resilience and socio-ecological forest systems approaches to this. All right, with that introduction, I'm delighted to pass the microphone over to Ruthie. Bear with me for just one moment while I call up Ruthie's presentation. All right, go ahead, Ruthie, as soon as the slides pop up on your screen.
All right, they're taking a minute to load. There we go. Can everyone see the presentation?
Yep, it looks great.
Awesome. Good deal. Well, thanks, Sonia, for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for joining in on this webinar today. My name is Ruth Sexton, and I'm a first-year master's student in the School of Food and Ag at UMaine. The first half of my presentation is going to cover the beginning stages of my research and kind of some background information, and then I'll get into our next steps and what we'll be doing in the coming months. And my research is on how to create more effective climate resilience outreach for farmers using mental models of their perceptions on climate change and farming systems. So just starting off the bat, mental models is kind of a new word for a lot of people. Oh, is that not switching?
I think if you give it a moment, it'll catch up. Sometimes it's just a little bit slow.
Okay, gotcha. Sorry for the lag. Okay, here we go. So starting off the bat, I want to get into mental models and what they are and how we can use them in research. So essentially, mental models are visual representations of how someone sees the world. And often they're used to understand not just what people think about certain issues, but how they think about them. So to give you an example, I made a mental model just to show how I think about community gardens. Just as an example. And then I added what I consider to be key components that are connected with it, like leadership, a good location, the cost, and then I thought the community gardens impact social relationships and food security, so I made those connections as well. If each of us here today were to sit down and really think about community gardens, we would probably each have something a little different in our mental models because each one is unique to the person that it originates from. And this is what makes using mental models in research so interesting because we can look at them across a group of people and find where those people have similar perceptions, where there are differences, and maybe even begin to understand how they make decisions based on their views. Having a little bit of a lag again.
Ruthie, why don't you try clicking the arrows in the bottom left-hand corner of the Adobe screen and see if that works better than the arrows on your computer.
Hey, look at that. Yes, it does. Thanks, Sonia, for the tip. I'm not a techie person. All right, so we've got that working. This is a quote that I found on a blog, so not a scientific source, but I think that it represents the concept of mental models pretty well. They say mental models are how we understand the world. Not only do they shape what we think and how we understand, but they shape the connections and opportunities that we see. So basically, they're how we process the world around us. And mental models have been used in research looking at farmers' perceptions of certain activities all around the world. So in 2014, Jacqueline Hallbrent led a really interesting study in Nepal that interviewed subsistence farmers and expert stakeholders to find out what both of those groups thought about cover cropping and minimum tillage, which are two pretty common conservation agriculture practices, and how they thought those practices would impact their farm. And they were able to use mental modeling to understand the differences between the farmers' and experts' perceptions, and then make conclusions about how experts could create outreach that was better suited to farmers' needs and ways of looking at these issues. Another study a few years later by Kieran Finlater looked at South African grain farmers and how they thought about climate and weather risks. So he also conducted mental modeling interviews with farmers to talk about their concerns about climate and weather. And they found that these farmers tended to talk about risks in 6 different languages: agricultural, economic, cognitive, political, emotional, and survival. And what was really interesting was that the people who talked in more agricultural and economic terms tended to actually utilize more conservation practices, like minimum tillage and cover cropping, than people who used more emotional or survival language. So people who are more concerned about their farm just surviving for the next season or the next year, or being able to provide for their family. And again, knowing this information about their perceptions and how they were talking about these risks, they were able to create outreach that was better targeted to their needs. But our research is occurring in a kind of different area of the world, so I want to bring this back to New England and just talk about what some of the projected climate changes are. I don't think I need to tell anybody that climate change is happening, but we just want to talk about this to frame the rest of our discussion. So these maps show projected changes in the number of days with 2+ and 4+ inches of rain from 1994 to 2055. And all of that dark green along the eastern seaboard indicates that there's a projection that we'll see 3 times as many days with over 4 inches of rain in those dark green areas. And for farmers, that means that they could see fewer days with dry enough soil to work out in the field. They could see more erosion, and they could see more runoff. And these are impacts that we've already been seeing in this area in the last few years due to increased precipitation. Next, we're definitely going to be seeing we'll probably be seeing some changes in temperature. These are projected changes, again, from 1994 to 2055 for temperature changes throughout the year. So in the bottom right, we see changes that are projected for the winter season. And in Maine, we might even be seeing an increase of 3.8 degrees Fahrenheit to as low as 2.0 down in West Virginia. But all the Northeast is expected to see some increase in temperature. And for farmers, this could mean that the growing season is lengthened, which could be an advantage. But along with that could be more pest pressure in the spring, which comes from more pests and weeds surviving those warmer winter temperatures. So some farmers are already adapting their practices to build resilience to these changes in climate. And the terms adaptations and resilience are a pretty common ideas that we talk a lot about in this field of research. So I just kind of want to go over them so we all know what we're talking about when we mention adaptations and resilience. One way I like to think about them is to think about a tool collection. So adaptations are like the tools that you use to fix something or to get a job done. You would use different tools depending on the situation and the material that you're working with. So in our case, farmers' tools are the adaptive strategies such as high tunnels, cover crops, or green manures that they can implement on their farm to better adapt to changes in climate or any of the needs on their farm. And resilience, on the other hand, I like to think of as the size or diversity of your tool collection. So the more tools that you have and the more different kinds of tools that you have, the better able you'll probably be to handle a wider variety of situations and challenges. Just like the more adaptive strategies that farmers can implement, the better able they might be able to meet the challenges of a changing climate in the future. So that brings us into our research questions that are guiding the research work that I'll be doing for my master's degree. Our first question is, how do farmers' perceptions about climate change influence their real-world decisions on climate change adaptation? So we know that mental models can be used to figure out farmers' perceptions and that their perceptions can have an influence on their decision-making. And we also know that climate change is definitely going to continue impacting ag in New England, and that farmers are going to need additional resources for adaptation and resilience. So this question comes out of that knowledge, and our research goal corresponding with that is to determine the thought processes that influence how small, medium, and beginning farmers, that's SMBF, make decisions on their farm, including how to adapt to climate change in order to build those outreach resources that are better suited to their needs. And then our second research question is, once we get an understanding of farmers' perceptions, what are the actual tools that would be most useful and accessible for them to learn about implementing these climate adaptive strategies? And our corresponding research goal is to determine those tools and resources. So I'm going to get into a bit of how we're going to do this. But before all that, when we talk about farmers, this is such a broad term. There are so many different types of farmers out there. There's livestock farmers and all the different kinds of them, and vegetable farmers, and large-scale industrial and small-scale subsistence farmers, and everything in between. So for our research, we're going to be looking specifically at this SMBF group, small, medium, and beginning farmers. And one of the reasons for that is that in Maine, a fairly substantial chunk of our farmer population are beginning farmers, which means that they've been farming for less than 10 years. And these farmers are a growing population in Maine and Vermont, and we expect that they're going to require some different types of information and resources on climate adaptation strategies versus more experienced farmers due to their lack of experience and smaller built-up knowledge base. And then small and medium farmers make up about 98% of all the farms in Maine. So we're going to be targeting them in our research to get a good idea of how local farmers think about climate change. We're also going to actively recruit some certain demographic groups of farmers that are typically at a social disadvantage. So one of these groups is women, who make up about 29% of all the principal farm operators in Maine. And the national average is only 14%, so we actually have more women farmers than average in Maine. But interestingly enough, a pretty large population of these women farmers are also beginning farmers. They have less than 10 years of experience. So again, these beginning women farmers are going to need those special targeted resources that will help them adapt to climate change as they're also starting out in farming. Another group we would like to actively recruit are Black or African American farmers. They make up a very tiny portion of Maine's farmer population, just about 1%, but unlike all the other groups, a majority of them are beginning farmers. And many of these farmers are also immigrants or refugees, particularly from Somalia. So these are people who are already having many challenges to get through in just everyday life, let alone dealing with challenges of climate change and starting up a farm. So they're a group that we particularly want to reach out to and hear their perspectives on what kind of resources are needed in the farming community. And before I get into some of our next steps of what we're going to be doing, I just really want to emphasize why we should be thinking about what farmers think about climate change. There currently aren't any resources available for farmers that are targeted to their level of scale of the farm or their level of experience. And this is pretty important because a small or medium vegetable farm is going to have different priorities and different needs and abilities to implement strategies when it comes to management practices than, for example, a large industrial scale potato farm. And experience also matters. Like I said, someone with just a few years of experience versus someone with 30 years of farming experience under their belt are going to have different levels of knowledge and skills. and that's going to influence the kinds of resources and the tools that they would need to be successful. And of course, successful, resilient farmers leads to more resilient communities and more food security. So it's a benefit for everybody. All right. So now we'll move into kind of how we're going to start addressing these questions. So again, question 1 was, how do farmers' perceptions about climate change influence their real-world decisions on climate change adaptation? The first thing we're going to do to figure this out is to interview 30 farmers and 15 experts in northern New England. And our questions are going to cover agricultural overviews. So an example question would be, what are you most concerned about in terms of Maine agriculture, or what are you most optimistic about? Just general questions about general agriculture. And then we're going to move into climate perspectives, which is more, how do you as a farmer or as an expert, and experts could be agricultural advisors or extension agents or university faculty. So how do you see climate change impacting your farm? Or for an expert, how do you see it impacting the farmers that you work with? Then we'll also ask about sources of information. So we'll ask where they get their information on climate variability and weather risks if they are concerned about that. And then barriers to adaptation and change. So what they see as some of the biggest barriers to actually implementing these strategies, be it financial or ecological, whatever they see as the biggest barriers to implementing change on their farm. And then finally, demographic information, so that we can keep track of things like gender and age. And then at the very end of each interview, we're going to do a mental modeling exercise with every participant. So we'll sit down with a participant, and this is an example of something we might say. I would now like you to participate in an exercise where you're trying to find the key components of a vegetable farm system in northern New England, including how these components may be connected. So if you remember my mental model with the community garden from earlier, we're going to be building something exactly like that. But instead of a community garden, it will be a farm system, and it will be built by the participants of our interviews. So just yesterday, we were able to have our first practice interview with an expert stakeholder here in Maine, and we built this mental model with her. So this is how she sees a farming system, the typical farming system that she interacts with. And the dollar signs there represent farm income and farm profit in the middle. And she thought that that was the most central component from which everything else is connected, basically. And so just, again, the key components of a mental model are the concepts, so money or inputs and labor or yield quality. And then each arrow between them represents a cause and effect connection. So see if I can use this arrow. So if you see this line right here, from money to crop advising / education, that means that this expert thought that the more money a farmer is making, the more access to crop advising and education that the farmer could have. And then each of these arrows is given a weight or a numerical value between -1 and +1, depending on whether the connection is positive or negative. So in the case of this model, all of these arrows are positive, which means that an increase in one concept would cause an increase in the other. And then a value can be put on those to represent the strength of the connection. So for example, the person we worked with yesterday gave a value of +1 to this connection between money and crop advising / education, which is the strongest you can have. So she thought that it was a very strong connection. And that's just an example of what we'll do after each interview, and then we'll be able to compare these mental models across individuals and across groups. So addressing question 2, what types of educational tools are the most useful and accessible for farmers learning about climate adaptive strategies? We're going to tackle this question by conducting focus groups with farmers. So hopefully, after we've done interviews, we'll conduct 8 to 10 focus groups with ideally 80 to 100 participants. recruited from community-based organizations like the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. And during these focus groups, we're going to be piloting educational materials about climate adaptive strategies. So for example, we might create a video and show it during the focus group. We might create a brochure or create a virtual farm tour of a local farm. And then participants will be given surveys before and after the focus groups to rate their knowledge of climate change and how they think it impacts their farm. And then we'll be able to compare those before and after surveys to see if they learned anything. And then they'll also be rating each educational material based on how effective they thought it was. So this way we can get a better idea of the tools and resources that farmers identify themselves as being the most useful for them. And ultimately, the outcome of our research is targeted and effective farmer outreach. And all of these smaller outcomes all contribute to that. So increased understanding of decision-making factors and perceptions about climate change among small, medium, and beginning farmers. That's going to come from the interviews and the mental modeling from question 1. And then a record of educational tools that farmers find the most effective and accessible. We'll hopefully find that from the focus groups. And combined, this understanding of decision-making factors and this record of tools can help us inform the development of resources to help build the climate resilience of small, medium, and beginning farmers that is more targeted and suited to their needs. So we have a lot of great collaborating organizations that are working on this. University of Maine and the University of Vermont are the primary collaborators. So as we conduct interviews and focus groups in Maine, a team in Vermont will be doing the same thing in Vermont. The Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, the USDA Northeast Climate Hub, the Women's Agricultural Network, and the Vermont New Farmer Project are both Vermont organizations, and the Beginning Farmer Resources Network from Maine are all collaborating with us. Many thanks to my advisor, Dr. Eric Gallant, Dr. Adam Dagnall, who is a co-PI on this project, Dr. Sonia Berthazel, who has given incredibly useful mentorship and expertise this last semester. Glenn Kohler contributed some of the climate projection figures, and Dr. Meredith Niles is the PI from UVM. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Ruthie. That was really great. And for those of you listening in, please do remember to type questions for Ruthie in the question box on the bottom right of your screen as we go and progress into Alyssa's talk. Next up, we have Alyssa Soucy, also from University of Maine, to tell us about forest stakeholder engagement. So bear with me a moment while I call up Alyssa's presentation. Go ahead, Alyssa, as soon as that pops up on your computer.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Alyssa Soucy. I am just wrapping up my first semester as an MS student at the University of Maine, working with Dr. Sandra Doyoresti-Stone here. And my work is focusing on fostering climate change resilience in the state, and we're approaching this from a socio-ecological perspective. And what I mean by that is we're looking at the social side, so the human side of vulnerability in our forests and resiliency, as well as the biophysical side of vulnerability and resilience. So as a lot of you know, climate change is expected to impact Maine's forests in a variety of ways. We've already seen some of these changes, such as changes in weather patterns and precipitation, but these figures on this slide are just showing some projected changes in temperature and precipitation in the northern, southern, and coastal regions of Maine by season. These are projections up to the year 2100, and you can see temperature projections show but an increase in 5 to 8 degrees depending on where you are, and precipitation is a bit more variable. We're projected to see increases in winter precipitation, maybe in the form of rain, and summer precipitation with minimal changes, even possibility of decreased precipitation. But in addition to those changes, there's also projections in increased growing season, which Ruthie hinted at, winter processes that might change, like snowpack, which would definitely influence foresters' harvesting, intense precipitation events becoming more frequent, changes in soil moisture patterns also having a huge impact on our foresters, insects and pathogens potentially increasing, and the big one is potential changes in forest composition. So this is a map that was put out this past year by the USDA, and these are projected changes in a couple of different tree species modeled by the end of the century to the year 2100, and it shows in low and high emission scenarios. So shades of red are decreases in tree species, while shades of green are increases in suitable habitat. So you can see red spruce actually has the potential to completely go away by the end of the 21st century, which is kind of crazy to think about and would have a huge impact on stakeholders in the state. But other species, such as pitch pine, we may actually see an increase. And as you may know, in the state of Maine, many people rely on our forests. They rely on these for clean water and air, food, fuel, recreation, carbon sequestration, cultural and aesthetic values. And it's not just these many ecosystem services, it's also the huge economic impact that our Maine forests have. It's $8.5 billion per year, and the forestry industry supports over 33,000 jobs, which is about 2.5% of Maine's current population. And with growing changes in the market globally, we had a couple of pulp and paper mills shut down in the past couple of years, and these changes are driving the changes that we see in Maine and putting increasing pressure on the system. Sorry guys, I just lost the connection. It is coming back.
I see that your internet is jumping in and out. We've got audio on you still, and so if you'd like to keep talking, if you have your notes, I'm happy to advance your slides for you, but obviously if you can get the connection back, that's best.
Okay. Can you guys currently see the slide, many people rely on our forests?
We've got it in front of us, yes.
Perfect. So yes, as these increasing global markets change and projections in climate change continue to have inherent uncertainty and lead to potential problems, there's an increased need to understand the vulnerability of Maine's forest system and to try to build resilience. And Ruthie was talking a lot about that idea of resilience, and I'm operating under that same definition. And from a human dimension standpoint, climate change risk perceptions have a huge impact on management decisions, which will ultimately influence the forest's socio-ecological resilience. So in a recent study in the U.S., they looked at climate change risk perceptions and compared them to different management strategies, and they saw differences in the perceptions as they compared to these strategies. So across the board, everyone supported overly thinning, overly dense forests, but other managing strategies were potentially polarizing, with those that believed in the anthropogenic origins of climate change and willing to adopt more management strategies. So it's all about understanding how these risk perceptions are going to impact management decisions and how potentially we can target these risk perceptions and stakeholders. And risk perceptions really vary among forest stakeholders in different regions of the world and different industries. So this is a study done in Canada, and more than 90% actually agreed with the anthropogenic origins of climate change. And these figures show the distribution of different subsectors of the forestry industries and their responses to 2 questions. The first being that climate change is currently having a significant impact on forest ecosystems, and all the blue shades show that there's strong agreement with that fact. And the second box is showing the effects of climate change on forest ecosystems are understood by forest managers. And so a lot of respondents actually believe that while it's a significant threat, it's not understood, which is a problem, of course. But then in a study done in the southern U.S. recently, only 60% believe that climate change is occurring, and in total, only 35% believe that it is at least partly anthropogenic origins. So there was a large percentage that were uncertain, didn't think there was enough evidence, and just outright didn't think that climate change is actually occurring. And this is similar to a study done in the entire U.S., which said that 33% of foresters rejected anthropogenic climate change. And so when we turn to Maine, there has, to my knowledge, been no work done on the entire state that is assessing these risk perceptions. And due to the variety of stakeholders and the diverse forest system, I'm not really sure what we're going to expect, and it's really important to understand those risk perceptions in the state. So the goal of my study overall is to develop and implement an integrated framework to assess the vulnerability and enhance the resilience of Maine's forest socio-ecological system to climate change. There's a couple of key objectives. The first is to understand those risk perceptions. The second is to incorporate those risk perceptions along with biophysical data to understand the socio-ecological vulnerability of Maine's forests. And the third step is to jointly identify best management strategies. But for the purpose of today, I'm just going to be focusing on assessing stakeholder awareness. And hopefully this research will lead to an increased resilience of our forest socio-ecological system. And we hope to do that through collaboration with stakeholders, through focus groups, through interviews and surveys. And obviously we hope to enhance the capacity of forest-based industries to prepare for climate change through action, or at least in my project as a seed grant, at least through understanding gaps in knowledge. So eventually we can build to action. And due to the diversity of Maine's forest system, we're hoping that this will have widespread application elsewhere. And from a conceptual standpoint, this study contributes to our understanding of drivers of climate change risk perceptions, how that influences behavior, and the overall vulnerability of Maine's forest. I just want to highlight a definition here. So when I'm talking about climate change risk perceptions, I'm talking about views that are directed at an external threat. They're directly related to information processing. So there's a difference between actual risk and perceived risk, and we're interested in the perceived risk. And so this is a framework developed by Van der Linden that is widely used. It's used to assess risk perceptions and understand what is causing those risk perceptions. So this model incorporates cognitive factors, so knowledge about the causes of climate change, the impacts, how you can respond to climate change. It incorporates experience, so if you've had a lot of experience with drought or insects and you associate that with climate change. Socio-cultural influences. So that includes norms and values. So if all my forester friends are doing this thing to adapt to climate change, then I might also try doing that thing and start talking more about climate change. Socio-demographics might influence perceived risk. We are adding in this idea of trust, so perceived similarity with the agency giving the information. So all of those things can contribute to perceived risk, which ultimately will influence behavior, and that is what we're interested in. So to do this, we're going to use a mixed methods approach to understand forest stakeholders' risk perceptions. So we're going to rely on gatekeepers and snowball sampling in the beginning. We're going to be conducting some interviews and getting expert opinions, and ultimately using a questionnaire to solve some of our big questions. So the first stage we've actually started, so I'm going to share a little bit of that with you guys. We've been doing interviews with stakeholders as part of another project, but we're going to be using that to influence the survey design. So we asked them what they are most concerned about when you look towards the future of the forestry industry. Some ideas that popped out were energy and production costs, infrastructure, investments, attracting and keeping young workers was a big one, and certain government policies. And so this quote was taken recently in 2018, and this is highlighting that main concern is the lack of economic resources. It's a rural state, sparsely populated, and an aging population. And these are some of the big things driving those future concerns. And this one is pointing more towards the fact that we're not competitive. We have old infrastructure, and it's not a very attractive place to invest. But with a little probing, we started to see some people actually start to talk about climate change as an issue. So this is about sudden warm spells. This was in a focus group last year. So sudden warm spells in winter having an effect on winter operations. We saw that a couple times in those interviews and focus groups. And this quote is talking more about the interaction between climate and invasive species and stress, which is another issue for foresters in the state. Also mentioning the idea of winter being different now than it was in the past, and it's harder to conduct a winter harvest. And this is another one about insects such as spruce budworm. So this interview, he says, I never thought, I assumed I wouldn't be around for the one that's coming. But I think it's so different. I think it's so different. And I think the climate is different. I think the forest is different. Everything is different. So regardless of what is causing climate change, from what we've learned from these focus groups, foresters are thinking about how potential changes in weather patterns are going to impact their operations. So the second part that's going to inform our survey design is we're going to use expert opinion using a short questionnaire and something called nominal group technique. And this actually allows participants to rank answers to a question, and then we can use those rankings to determine other things such as vulnerability. Pretty much we can get out what's important to our stakeholders. So we're going to be asking experts to share their opinions on climate change impacts, and they're going to rank them. We're going to ask them to rank the top 5 tree species most important to their business operations and the top 5 tree species most vulnerable to climate change. In addition, we're also going to be asking them a question on what management decisions they would be willing to use, which will definitely influence what we include in our survey. So the last step is our online questionnaire. It's going to consist of Likert type questions, and it's going to measure all of these constructs that influence perceived risk. So we're going to be measuring the big ones I'll highlight on. So we're going to be measuring cognitive factors. So we might ask them about what are the causes of climate change, because it's been shown that if they think that it's anthropogenic, that might increase their perceived risk. We're going to ask them about experience, and that's a really big one. So we'll ask them if they've ever experienced problems with insects, drought, changes in weather. And this question is going to stem heavily from those expert interviews. And in terms of socio-cultural, we'll ask them their values, so their feelings toward wildlife and social norms. I think that is what's going to strongly predict that perceived climate change risk. So this is just expected results. We haven't collected anything yet. It's a graph of increasing values against perceived climate change risk. And so I think knowledge and experience, the black and the blue lines, will have the greatest influence based on previous literature. Some other potential things that could arise out of this is that females might have higher risk perceptions, and being liberal might have higher risk perceptions, again, based on the risk literature. I also think that having more years experience would impact risk perceptions, maybe just because they've seen more, they've seen the long-term impacts. Some other things that I expect to come out of this is that the perceived risk will be associated with management decisions, like that previous study that I touched upon at the beginning. And I also think that forest management practices and these risk perceptions may actually transcend the participant's professional role. So whether you're from an NGO, whether you work for a corporation, you're a logger, I think those risk perceptions and practices are going to depend on the constructs rather than the role, based on some literature. So to put this in perspective, some of the next steps is to do the survey, and from that we'll understand the drivers of risk perception, which will inform the creation and style of education materials that we will use in our participatory workshops. And the second big step is a vulnerability assessment, and we'll take some of the knowledge that we gain from the risk perception survey, combine it with biophysical data to identify vulnerable hotspots in the state. And we hope to use those during the participatory workshops to inform management decisions. So this project is very much, in progress. I've been developing a lot of this over the semester, thanks to all of my advisors, Sandra and Perry, and Dr. Aaron Weiskettle, Dr. Adam Digno, and all of the professors and students in a class that's been developing the proposal, my lab mates, and our partnership with AvantGrid and USDA, which provided the financial support for this research. I look forward to answering any of your questions and also any suggestions that you may have, because this is in its very baby stage. So I look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Really interesting to hear what you've been up to. So do continue to type questions for Alyssa as we go, and we'll begin the question and answer in just 1 minute. Before we get to that, I do want to remind you to check out our website for past webinar recordings in this series. The link is at the bottom of the screen there, so I'll just keep this up as a backdrop while we move into the question and answer session. So we'll do about 5 minutes of Q&A. All right, first up, I have a question for you, Ruthie. Do you think the type of crops that farmers are growing will influence how they think about climate change?
Yeah, I think it definitely could. And we're going to try to focus more on vegetable farmers as opposed to, well, I guess that still applies to the type of crop question. But we're going to be focusing on vegetable farmers just so we get a little bit less variability than if we were focusing on many different sectors. But I do think that the type of crop could influence how farmers think about climate change, because those crops are going to have different temperature and precipitation requirements. They're going to respond differently to changes in climate. And if you're growing a crop that's typically very resilient to those changes, then the farmer might not have to think about climate change as much as someone who's growing more sensitive crops. So I think that it would.
Great, thanks. Next up, I've got a question for you, Alyssa. Brooke is wondering, could you give a few examples of different stakeholder groups you will target? And do you think some of them feel their business is threatened by the environmental perspective and potential actions to adapt to and mitigate climate change?
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at, I don't know if I mentioned this, but we're going to rely on gatekeepers. So the CFRU at the university has a lot of members, and they're going to send an email to all of those members. So that includes NGOs, employees of large companies like Irving, small lot owners. So it's a lot of different groups, but all under this subheading of forest stakeholders. We're keeping it just a commercial. We're not interested in tourism just because it would be too much. And so the second question, I hope I'm interpreting this right. So you're asking if some of them feel threatened by the idea of climate change mitigation and adaptation.
I'm thinking of, like, in West Virginia, like, coal miners feel threatened by environmental groups that want to kind of take away that opportunity for them, and I wonder if there's kind of a similar thing going on with forest stakeholders.
I see. That's interesting. I don't think it's the case here, and from what I've read, the way that people present the data to them, they might not touch so much on climate change, but just weather variability as a whole, because foresters want to be able to survive they want to be able to predict when to harvest in the winter. So I don't think they'll see it as a threat, but I do think that you might have less engagement with those that don't believe in climate change. But I'm not sure I would categorize it as a threat per se. I think a lot of foresters now do realize it is an issue. I hope that they'll respond well.
Great, thanks, Alyssa. A question for Ruthie next. Margaret asks, what is the breakdown of organic and conventional growers in your project?
Yeah, so we don't have a specific breakdown, but I expect that most of our farmers are going to be organic, mostly because the organizations that we're working with to recruit farmers for interviews are like more organic or sustainable focused, like the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. So the farmers that are in contact with them are naturally going to be probably more organic than conventional, but that's not to say that we would rule out interviewing someone who isn't certified organic. If they are a small, medium, or beginning farmer, then we could interview them. And then I see there's a second part. If you're interviewing those groups, do you expect a difference in responses? Yeah, I think I would expect some difference because, especially here in Maine, a lot of organic farmers are younger and tend to farm because they love that lifestyle and have the viewpoint of like environmental sustainability. So I would think that organic growers would tend to be thinking about climate change, or at least to acknowledge that it's an issue. And conventional growers, I think they still could. Where I'm from in South Dakota, conventional growers definitely do not talk about climate change as much, and I would expect a similar response here. But if they're a small or a beginning farmer, then they might have different perceptions. So.
Great, thanks. And we've got time for just one more question. Alyssa, are you looking at maple producers at all as part of your work, or is it focused more on timber industry?
That's a super good question, actually. Got my brain working a little bit. We are more so interested just in the timber industry, loggers, mill workers, and corporations. But I think you could do so much looking at those different subsectors. It's just outside the scope. Like I mentioned, we were also potentially interested in tourism and recreation and comparing those as well. Yeah, that's a great thought, and I wish we had time to really get a handle on all of the forest stakeholders, but unfortunately, I will not be looking at that too much.
No worries. All right. Thank you all for participating in this webinar. And do tune into some of the others in this